Some wounds never heal, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. When aging cowboy Eli Brandt loses his herd in the Utah Canyonlands, he never expects to find something that will shatter his world completely. Deep in the mountains, Eli and his faithful dog Boone discover an abandoned wagon that time forgot. But what's inside stops them cold. The belongings of his brother Caleb, who disappeared 30 years ago. The brothers had parted in anger, and Eli has carried that guilt ever since. Now, following mysterious clues across the desert, Eli must face the painful truth about what happened to his brother. The land holds memories, and his dog senses something dark lurking beneath the surface. But what terrible secret has been hiding in these mountains for 3 decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of Eli Brandt's front porch as he sat in his grandfather's rocking chair, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. At 62, Eli had the kind of face that told stories, deep lines etched by decades of desert wind, eyes the color of sage under a summer sky, and silver hair that refused to stay tamed beneath his worn Stetson. The Lazy Bee Ranch stretched out before him. 3,000 acres of red rock and scrub brush that had been in the Brandt family for 4 generations. Boone, his 12-year-old blue heeler, lay at his feet with the patient dignity that comes with age and countless shared miles. The dog's coat had gone gray around the muzzle, and his once bright eyes now held the cloudy film of advancing years, but his ears still perked at every distant sound. They were 2 old-timers keeping each other company in the quiet hours before dawn broke fully over the canyon rim. Eli reached down and scratched behind Boone's ears, earning a contented sigh from his companion. "Another day, old boy," he murmured, though his voice carried the weight of routine rather than enthusiasm. Since his wife Sarah had passed 5 years ago, the ranch felt too big, too quiet. The cattle still needed tending. The fences still needed mending. But the joy had leaked out of the work like water from a cracked bucket. He'd been thinking about Caleb again, something that happened more often as the years passed. His younger brother would have been 58 now, if he'd lived. If he hadn't vanished into the red rock country without so much as a goodbye. Eli's jaw tightened as he remembered their last conversation, the harsh words that had driven a wedge between them that death had made permanent. The brothers had been inseparable once. Born 3 years apart, they'd grown up wild and free on this same stretch of land, learning to ride before they could properly walk, tracking deer through the canyons, swimming in the hidden pools that formed after summer storms. Their father, Big Jim Brandt, had raised them with a firm hand and an open heart, teaching them that a man's word was his bond and that family came before everything else. Caleb had always been the dreamer, the one with his head in the clouds and poetry in his soul. While Eli focused on the practical matters of ranch life, fixing machinery, calculating feed costs, planning grazing rotations, Caleb would disappear for hours with a book or his sketchpad, returning with stories about hidden caves or unusual rock formations he'd discovered in his wanderings. "That boy's got the wandering sickness," their father used to say with affection. "Good thing you're here to keep his feet on the ground, Eli." And Eli had taken that responsibility seriously, perhaps too seriously. As the older brother, he'd felt the weight of family expectations. When their parents died in a car accident when Eli was 25 and Caleb 22, it was Eli who took over the ranch operations, Eli who handled the legal matters, Eli who made the hard decisions about money and land and livestock. Caleb had stayed for a while, working alongside his brother with genuine effort but obvious restlessness. He'd talk about traveling, about seeing the world beyond the canyon walls, about maybe going to college or trying his hand at writing. Eli had listened with growing impatience, unable to understand how Caleb could even consider leaving the land that had been their inheritance. Their birthright. The tension had built slowly, like pressure in a steam boiler. Small disagreements about ranch management escalated into arguments about responsibility and commitment. Eli saw Caleb's dreams as childish fantasies that threatened the family legacy. Caleb saw Eli's dedication as narrow-minded stubbornness that would trap them both in a life too small for their potential. The breaking point had come on a bitter February morning 30 years ago. Caleb had announced his intention to sell his half of the ranch and use the money to fund his travels. The argument that followed had been vicious and final, both brothers saying things that couldn't be taken back. "You're running away," Eli had accused, his voice cold with betrayal. "Just like you always do when things get difficult." Dad would be ashamed. Caleb's face had gone white, then red with anger. "And you're so afraid of change that you'd rather die in the same place you were born than risk actually living. You think holding on to this land makes you a man, but all it makes you is a prisoner." "Then get out," Eli had said, the words coming out harder and more final than he'd intended. "Sell your half to me and get out. But don't come crawling back when the world chews you up and spits you out." Caleb had stared at him for a long moment, something dying in his eyes. "You know what, Eli? I won't come back, ever. You can have your precious ranch all to yourself." Those had been the last words they'd spoken to each other. Within a week, Caleb had completed the legal paperwork, sold his share of the Lazy Bee to Eli, and disappeared into the vast expanse of the American West. For the first few years, there had been occasional postcards, a picture of the Grand Canyon, a view of the Pacific coast, a snapshot of a mountain town in Colorado, but never with a return address, never with more than a brief "doing well" "C" scrawled on the back. Then even the postcards had stopped coming. Eli had told himself he didn't care. He'd thrown himself into ranch work with renewed determination, building the Lazy Bee into one of the most successful operations in the region. He'd married Sarah, a schoolteacher from town who understood his quiet ways and loved the land almost as much as he did. They'd built a good life together, even if children had never come to bless their union. But in the quiet moments, especially after Sarah's death, Eli found himself wondering what had become of his brother. Was Caleb still alive? Had he found the adventure he'd been seeking? Did he ever think about home, about the ranch, about the brother he'd left behind? The questions had grown sharper with age, tinged with regret that Eli was finally old enough to acknowledge. He'd been young and proud and afraid of losing the only life he'd ever known. Caleb had been young and restless and desperate to find his place in the world. Maybe they'd both been right in their own ways. Maybe they'd both been terribly wrong. Now, sitting on the porch with dawn breaking over the canyon rim, Eli felt the familiar ache of unfinished business. Boone stirred at his feet, lifting his graying head to look toward the distant mountains where the last stars were fading into blue sky. "Come on, boy," Eli said, setting down his coffee cup and rising from the rocking chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had logged too many miles in the saddle. "Those cattle won't gather themselves. The day's work was supposed to be routine, moving the herd from the winter pasture to fresh grazing land in the high country. It was work Eli and Boone had done countless times, following familiar trails through red rock canyons and across sage-covered mesas. The cattle knew the routine as well as they did, moving with the lazy confidence of animals who trusted their human guides to lead them to water and grass. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, following a trail that wound between towering sandstone formations, something felt different. Boone kept lifting his head to test the wind, his ears pricked forward with an alertness that made Eli pay closer attention to their surroundings. The dog had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was out of place, whether it was a predator stalking the herd or a storm building beyond the horizon. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked, bringing his horse to a halt on a narrow ledge that overlooked a maze of side canyons. "You smell something?" Boone whined softly, his tail held low and tense. Down in the main canyon, the cattle had spread out along a seasonal creek, drinking and grazing with apparent contentment. But something had definitely caught the dog's attention, something that made his hackles rise despite the peaceful scene below. Eli dismounted and pulled out his binoculars, scanning the terrain with the practiced eye of a man who'd been reading the land for most of his life. At first, everything looked normal, the familiar patterns of erosion and vegetation, the scattered boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls over countless centuries, the thin line of green that marked the creek's course through the desert landscape. Then he saw it, a dark smudge against the red rock, partially hidden by a stand of juniper trees. At this distance, it could have been anything, a shadow, a rock formation, maybe even a cluster of dead trees. But something about its shape nagged at him, a geometric regularity that didn't belong in this wild place. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, adjusting the focus on his binoculars. "Boone, I think we've got ourselves a mystery." The object was definitely man-made, the remains of a wagon by the look of it, though what it was doing in this remote canyon was anybody's guess. The nearest road was miles away, and the terrain was far too rough for any normal wagon travel. Yet there it sat, listing to one side like a ship run aground on a reef of red stone. Eli felt a strange stirring in his chest, a mixture of curiosity and unease that he couldn't quite explain. In all his years of riding these canyons, he'd never seen anything like it. The wagon looked old, decades old at least, its wooden sides weathered grey by sun and wind. Whatever story it had to tell, it had been keeping its secrets for a very long time. He whistled softly to Boone, who bounded up the rocks to his side with surprising agility for his age. "What do you think, old friend? Worth a closer look?" The dog's tail had stopped wagging, but his eyes were bright with interest. Whatever he was sensing down in that canyon, it was something important, something that deserved investigation. Eli made his decision with the quick practicality that had served him well for 6 decades. The cattle were settled for the afternoon, and they knew their way home if something happened to delay his return. Boone needed the exercise, and Eli needed the distraction from his own thoughts. Most importantly, he needed to know what secrets that abandoned wagon might hold. In a life that had grown increasingly predictable with age, the promise of mystery was too tempting to ignore. The descent into the canyon took longer than Eli had expected. What had looked like a straightforward path from above turned out to be a treacherous maze of loose rock and hidden crevices. His horse, a steady-footed quarter-horse named Buck, picked his way down the steep slope with the careful precision of an animal who'd learned that one wrong step in this country could mean death. Boone ran ahead, his nose to the ground, following some scent trail that only he could detect. Every few yards, the old dog would stop and look back at Eli, his expression urgent, as if to say they needed to hurry. The closer they got to the wagon, the more agitated Boone became, whining softly and circling back to nudge against Eli's leg. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, dismounting when the terrain became too steep for Buck to navigate safely. "We're almost there." The wagon sat in a small clearing, surrounded by ancient junipers, their twisted branches providing a natural screen that had hidden the wreck from casual view. Up close, Eli could see that it wasn't just abandoned, it had been deliberately concealed. Brush had been piled around the wheels, and someone had taken the time to drape canvas over the most visible parts of the frame. But time and weather had done their work. The canvas had rotted away in places, and the concealing brush had dried to tinder. What remained was a skeleton of weathered wood and rusted iron. Listing heavily to one side, where the left rear wheel had collapsed into a tangle of splintered spokes, Eli approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the thick carpet of juniper needles that covered the ground. Something about the scene felt wrong, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way the shadows fell across the clearing, or the unnatural silence that seemed to press down from the canyon walls. Even the ever-present wind had died to barely a whisper. Boone had stopped his anxious circling and now sat perfectly still about 10 feet from the wagon, his ears flat against his head and his tail tucked low. The dog was clearly frightened, but he wasn't backing away. Instead, he seemed to be standing guard, protecting Eli from whatever danger he sensed in the wreckage. "What's got you spooked, old friend?" Eli asked, kneeling beside the dog and running his hand along Boone's trembling flanks. "It's just an old wagon. Can't hurt anybody now." But as he stood and walked closer to the wreck, Eli began to understand his companion's unease. There was something profoundly disturbing about the scene, something that went beyond simple abandonment. The wagon hadn't been left here by accident or circumstance. It had been hidden, deliberately and carefully, by someone who desperately wanted to keep its contents secret. The back of the wagon was covered by a canvas tarp that had somehow survived the decades better than the rest of the covering. Eli hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the rope that held the tarp in place. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave this mystery buried where someone had obviously intended it to stay. But a larger part, the part that had always needed to know, to understand, to solve the puzzles that life presented, compelled him forward. He untied the rope with fingers that shook slightly from more than just the mountain cold. The canvas fell away with a whisper, revealing a collection of objects that made his heart stop in his chest. A leather saddle, hand-tooled with a distinctive pattern of desert roses that Eli recognized immediately. A pair of worn chaps, the kind that cowboys wore for hard riding through rough country. A wooden box that had once held ammunition, now serving as a makeshift chest for smaller items. And lying on top of everything else, as if it had been placed there deliberately for someone to find. A water-damaged leather journal bound with a strip of rawhide. Eli's hands trembled as he reached for the journal. Though he already knew what he would find written on the first page in his brother's familiar handwriting, property of Caleb James Brandt, Jesus. Mary and Joseph, he whispered, the words coming out like a prayer or a curse. Caleb! The journal fell open in his hands to a page near the middle, the ink faded but still legible. His brother's voice seemed to speak to him across 30 years of silence. February 15th. Another fight with Eli today. Worse than usual. He thinks I'm running away from responsibility, but he doesn't understand that I'm running toward something. There's a whole world out there beyond these canyon walls, and I'm dying a little more each day, trying to pretend that this ranch is enough for me. Maybe it would be different if he could see that loving this land doesn't have to mean being trapped by it. Maybe it would be different if I could make him understand that there are different ways to honor what Dad left us. Eli closed the journal with a snap, unable to read any more. The guilt that he'd carried for 30 years crashed over him like a flash flood, washing away all the careful justifications he'd built up over the decades. Caleb hadn't just left, he'd been driven away. Driven away by his older brother's stubborn inability to understand that people could love the same thing in different ways. But why was the journal here, in this hidden wagon? And where was Caleb himself? Eli forced himself to examine the rest of the wagon's contents with methodical care, though his mind was reeling from the implications of what he'd already found. The saddle and chaps confirmed what the journal had already told him. These were definitely Caleb's belongings. But there were other items too, things that suggested his brother hadn't been traveling alone. A second saddle, smaller and more delicately made, clearly intended for a woman. A child's wooden toy horse, carved with the kind of loving attention to detail that spoke of hours spent whittling by firelight. And tucked into a corner of the ammunition box, a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected its contents from the worst of the weather. With shaking fingers, Eli unwrapped the bundle to reveal a faded photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed Caleb standing next to a beautiful dark-haired woman, his arm around her waist in a gesture of obvious affection. The woman was pregnant, her condition clearly visible despite the loose-fitting dress she wore. Standing beside them was a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who bore such a strong resemblance to Caleb that he could only be family. Eli turned the photograph over and found an inscription in his brother's handwriting, Maria, Miguel, and me. June 1995, new family, new life, new hope. June 1995, just 4 months after Caleb had left the ranch in anger and bitterness. 4 months after their final argument. His brother had found love, had found the family that the Lazy Bee Ranch had never been able to provide. Had found the new beginning that Eli's harsh words had driven him to seek. The folded paper was a letter, addressed to my dear brother Eli in Caleb's careful script. Eli's hands shook as he unfolded it, afraid of what message his brother might have left for him. Eli, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I hope to God that day never comes, but a man in my situation has to prepare for the worst. I know you think I ran away like a coward, and maybe you're right. But I ran towards something too, toward love, toward family, toward a chance to be the man I was meant to be instead of the man you thought I should be. Her name is Maria Sandoval, and she's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, inside and out. The boy is Miguel, her son from a previous relationship, but he's become like my own. We're going to have a baby, Eli. I'm going to be a father. I wish I could share this joy with you, but I know you wouldn't understand. You never understood that a man can love more than one thing at a time. We're heading north toward Colorado, where Maria has family who can help us start over. I know I should have told you about them, should have brought them home to meet you, but after our fight, I didn't think you'd welcome them. I was probably wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. If something happens to us, if we don't make it to Colorado, I want you to know that I forgave you long ago for the things you said. I even understood them in my way. You were afraid of losing the ranch, afraid of losing me, afraid of being alone with all that responsibility. But brother, you could never lose me. Not really. Blood is thicker than anger, and love is stronger than pride. I hope someday you'll find a woman who makes you as happy as Maria makes me. I hope someday you'll understand that there's room in a man's heart for many kinds of love. And I hope someday we'll sit on Dad's porch again and laugh about how foolish we both were when we were young. Your loving brother, Caleb P.S. If you find this letter, it means you also found the wagon. Look for Maria's locket. She never takes it off. And if it's here with her other things, then you'll know we didn't abandon this place by choice. We were running from something, Eli, something dangerous. Be careful! Eli read the letter twice before the words fully penetrated the fog of shock and grief that had settled over his mind. Caleb had been planning to reach out, to rebuild their relationship, to introduce him to the family that had brought such joy to his brother's life. And something had stopped him, something dangerous enough to make a young man hide his most precious possessions in a remote canyon and write a letter that read like a final goodbye. Boone whined softly and pressed against Eli's leg, offering the kind of wordless comfort that only a dog could provide. The old cowboy reached down and scratched behind his companion's ears, drawing strength from the familiar gesture. "You're right, boy," he said quietly. "We need to find that locket, and then we need to figure out what happened to my brother and his family." But even as he spoke the words, Eli knew that finding the truth about Caleb's fate would mean confronting secrets that someone had killed to protect. The wagon hadn't been simply abandoned. It had been deliberately hidden by people who never wanted its contents to be found. Now, 30 years later, an aging cowboy and his faithful dog had stumbled onto a mystery that promised to shatter everything Eli thought he knew about his brother's disappearance. The question was whether they were strong enough to survive. Learning the truth, the sun was directly overhead when Eli finally forced himself to step back from the wagon and think methodically about what he'd discovered. Caleb's letter had mentioned Maria's locket, and if it was here among the hidden belongings, it would confirm his brother's worst fears about what had happened to them. Boone had been pacing in ever-widening circles around the clearing, his nose pressed to the ground as he followed scent trails that only he could detect. Suddenly the old dog stopped near a cluster of boulders, about 20 feet from the wagon, whining and pawing at the rocky ground with increasing urgency. "What is it, boy?" Eli called, grateful for any distraction from the weight of his brother's letter. "You find something?" The dog looked back at him with an expression of such clear intelligence that it never failed to amaze Eli, even after 12 years of partnership. Boone's message was unmistakable. "Come here, now. This is important." Eli walked over to where Boone was digging, kneeling down to examine the ground more closely. At first glance, it looked like ordinary desert soil, sandy, rocky, scattered with the detritus of countless seasons. But as he brushed away the surface layer, his fingers encountered something that definitely didn't belong. The locket was tarnished almost black with age, but the ornate silver scrollwork was still visible beneath the patina. It was the kind of jewelry that spoke of careful craftsmanship and considerable expense, far too valuable to have been simply dropped and forgotten. Someone had buried it here deliberately, along with whatever secrets it contained. Eli wiped the locket clean with his bandana, revealing the intricate pattern of roses and vines that decorated its surface. It was beautiful work, the kind of heirloom that passed from mother to daughter through generations. His hands trembled slightly as he found the catch and opened it with the gentle pressure of his thumbnail. Inside, protected by the locket's sealed compartment, was a small photograph of a young boy, the same child who had appeared in the family portrait he'd found in the wagon, but several years younger. On the opposite side of the locket, engraved in delicate script, were the words, "Para Miguel, con todo mi amor." Mama, for Miguel, with all my love, Mama. The boy wasn't just Maria's son. He was the center of her world. The reason she wore this locket close to her heart every day. And if Caleb was right, if Maria never took it off, then finding it buried here could only mean one thing. Eli closed the locket with infinite care and slipped it into his shirt pocket, where it rested against his heart like a lead weight. He had spent 30 years believing that his brother had abandoned their family legacy for a life of selfish adventure. Now he was beginning to understand that Caleb had been building a new kind of legacy, one based on love rather than land, on chosen family rather than inherited obligation, and someone had destroyed it. "Come on, Boone," he said quietly. "Let's see what else this place has to tell us." They spent the next 2 hours conducting a methodical search of the area around the wagon. Boone's superior senses led them to several more discoveries. A child's leather shoe, worn thin and cracked by weather. A woman's hair comb, decorated with small turquoise stones. And most disturbing of all, a patch of ground where the soil had a different color and texture, as if it had been disturbed and then carefully rearranged. Eli didn't want to think about what might be buried beneath that patch of earth. Some truths were too terrible to uncover without proper preparation, and he wasn't ready to face the full implications of what he was beginning to suspect. By mid-afternoon, the cattle had begun their restless movement toward home, and Eli knew he had to make a choice. He could gather the herd and return to the ranch, filing away this discovery as another of life's unsolvable mysteries. Or he could pursue the truth, no matter where it led or what it cost him. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. Caleb had been his brother, his blood, his responsibility. For 30 years, Eli had told himself that Caleb's disappearance was just another example of his younger brother's restless irresponsibility. Now he knew better, and with that knowledge came an obligation that superseded everything else. The cattle knew their way home. They'd been making this trip for years. Eli mounted Buck and whistled for Boone, pointing toward the trail that led out of the canyon. It was time to visit Red Mesa, the closest thing to a real town in this part of the country, and start asking questions that should have been asked 30 years ago. Red Mesa sat in a wide valley between two sandstone bluffs, a collection of weathered buildings that served the scattered ranchers and miners who worked the surrounding country. The town had never been much to look at. A general store, a diner, a gas station, and a handful of houses clustered around the intersection of two dirt roads. But it was the kind of place where people noticed strangers and remembered unusual events. Eli tied Buck to the hitching post outside Rosie's diner and pushed through the screen door with Boone at his heels. The interior was exactly as he remembered from his infrequent visits over the years. Red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome stools, and walls covered with decades of accumulated photographs and local memorabilia. Rosie Martinez herself was behind the counter, her grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and her dark eyes still sharp despite her 70-odd years. She'd been running the diner since before Eli was born, and she had the kind of memory for faces and stories that made her the unofficial historian of Red Mesa. Well, she said with a smile that transformed her weathered face. "Eli Brandt, haven't seen you in town for months. How are you holding up out there on the lazy bee?" "Getting by, Rosie, getting by." Eli slid onto one of the counter stools and accepted the cup of coffee she poured without being asked. "Actually, I was hoping you might be able to help me with something. I'm trying to track down some information about my brother Caleb." Rosie's expression grew more serious. "Caleb, Lord Eli, I haven't heard that name in years. He left the valley a long time ago, didn't he? Must be going on 30 years now." 30 years exactly. Eli pulled the photograph from his shirt pocket and laid it on the counter between them. I found this picture, and I'm hoping you might recognize the woman and boy. It's dated 1995, right around the time Caleb disappeared. Rosie picked up the photograph and studied it carefully, her eyebrows drawing together in concentration. "Well, I'll be damned," she said softly. "That's Maria Sandoval. Haven't thought about her in decades." Eli's pulse quickened. "You knew her?" "Knew her? Hell, Eli. She worked right here in this diner for almost 6 months. Sweet girl, but she was running from something or someone. Never talked much about her past, but you could see the fear in her eyes. And that boy of hers, Miguel, he was a good kid. Quiet, polite, always had his nose in a book. What happened to them?" Rosie's expression grew troubled. "That's the thing, Eli. They just disappeared one day. Left all their belongings in the little apartment they were renting above Peterson's store. Maria's tips from the week before were still in her apron pocket. It was like they just vanished into thin air. When exactly was this? Late summer of 95, maybe August, early September. I remember because we'd just gotten our first frost, and I was worried about them having enough warm clothes for the boy." Rosie shook her head sadly. "Sheriff Morrison investigated, of course, but he said they'd probably just moved on without telling anybody. Said people like that, meaning Mexican people, though he was too much of a politician to say it outright, were naturally unreliable." The mention of Sheriff Morrison sent a chill down Eli's spine. Wade Morrison had been a hard man with a reputation for taking care of problems in his own way, regardless of what the law might say about proper procedure. "If he'd been involved in the investigation, Rosie," Eli said carefully, "you said Maria was running from something. Do you have any idea what?" The older woman glanced around the diner to make sure they weren't being overheard, though the only other customer was an old rancher reading a newspaper in the back booth. "There were rumors," she said quietly. "Nothing I could prove, you understand. But Maria let slip once that she'd seen something she shouldn't have down in Arizona. Something involving the people she used to work for." "What kind of people?" "The kind who don't like witnesses, if you catch my meaning." Rosie refilled his coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. "Look, Eli, I don't know what you're digging into here, but you might want to let sleeping dogs lie. There are some stones in this county that are better left unturned." But Eli was beyond the point of backing down now. The locket in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, reminding him of the promises he'd made to his brother's memory. "One more question, Rosie. Did you ever see Caleb with Maria and the boy?" "Once," she admitted, "right before they disappeared. He came into town driving an old pickup truck, and the three of them left together. I assumed they'd decided to try their luck somewhere else, maybe Colorado or New Mexico. But now that I think about it, Caleb looked scared too. Really scared." Eli stood up and left money on the counter for the coffee, his mind already racing ahead to the next step in his investigation. "Thanks, Rosie. You've been more help than you know." "Eli," she called as he reached the door, "be careful. Whatever happened to your brother and that family, it wasn't natural. And the people responsible, well, some of them might still be around." The ride back to the Wagon site took on an urgency that Eli hadn't felt in years. Rosie's words echoed in his mind as Buck picked his way down the treacherous canyon trail, each hoofbeat marking time with the growing certainty that his brother's disappearance had been far from voluntary. Maria and Miguel hadn't simply moved on to try their luck elsewhere. They'd been running for their lives, and somehow Caleb had gotten caught up in their desperate flight. Boone trotted ahead with renewed purpose, as if he too understood that they were no longer just investigating an old mystery, but pursuing active danger. The dog's ears were constantly moving, tracking sounds that Eli's aging hearing couldn't detect, and more than once he stopped to look back toward the trail they'd just traveled. His hackles raised in warning. "You sense them too, don't you, boy?" Eli murmured as they reached the hidden clearing where the wagon sat like a monument to interrupted dreams. Someone's been watching this place, maybe for a long time. The thought should have been frightening, but instead Eli felt a strange sense of relief. For 30 years, he'd lived with the gnawing guilt of driving his brother away with harsh words and stubborn pride. Now he was beginning to understand that those words, while regrettable, hadn't been the real reason for Caleb's disappearance. His brother had been trying to protect the people he loved, and that protective instinct had cost him everything. Eli dismounted and began examining the wagon's contents with fresh eyes, looking for clues he might have missed during his initial shock at finding Caleb's belongings. This time, he noticed details that hadn't registered before, scratches on the wooden sides that looked deliberate rather than accidental, rope burns on the canvas covering that suggested the wagon had been secured and moved multiple times, and most intriguingly, a piece of tree bark tucked into a corner of the ammunition box. The bark had been carefully stripped from what looked like an aspen tree, and someone had used a knife to carve lines and symbols into its pale surface. At first glance, it looked like random scratches, but as Eli studied it more closely, patterns began to emerge. The lines formed a rough map of the canyon system, with X marks indicating specific locations and dotted lines showing hidden trails that wouldn't appear on any official survey. One of the X marks was positioned exactly where they now sat, confirming that the wagon's location had been carefully chosen rather than accidental. But the other marks spread out across a much wider area, following a network of side canyons and hidden valleys that Eli knew existed but had never fully explored. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly, tracing the carved lines with his fingertip. "Caleb, you always were the clever one." The map was clearly intended as a guide, probably drawn by someone with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. But a guide to what? And why had it been hidden with Caleb's other belongings, instead of taken along on whatever journey had ended so tragically? Boone appeared at his elbow, whining softly and nudging against the bark map with his nose. The dog's message was clear. This is important. This will lead us to answers. Eli looked up at the sun's position and calculated the remaining daylight. There were maybe 4 hours before darkness made travel through the canyons too dangerous, even for someone with his experience. 4 hours to follow, at least part of the trail that the map indicated, to see what secrets might be hidden in the deeper reaches of the canyon system. "All right, boy," he said, folding the bark map carefully and tucking it into his saddlebag. "Let's see where this leads us." The first X mark on the map led them deeper into the canyon system, following a narrow game trail that wound between towering walls of red sandstone. The path was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, and in some places Eli had to dismount and lead Buck through passages where the walls closed in to form natural bottlenecks. It was slow, careful work that required complete attention to every step. One wrong move could send horse and rider tumbling into the boulder-strewn canyon floor hundreds of feet below. But Eli had been riding these trails since he was old enough to sit a saddle, and Buck had the sure-footed intelligence that came from years of navigating difficult terrain. Boone ranged ahead, his nose to the ground as he followed scent trails that were invisible to human senses. More than once, the dog stopped and looked back with an expression of confusion, as if he was detecting conflicting information that didn't make sense. Old scents mixed with newer ones, familiar odors tangled with hints of danger that made his hackles rise. The first X mark led to a natural shelf in the canyon wall, hidden behind a screen of scrub oak and pinon pine. From below, it would have been completely invisible, but from the trail, it offered a perfect vantage point for watching the approaches to the canyon. More importantly, it showed clear signs of long-term human habitation. Someone had built a small fire ring from carefully selected stones, positioned so that the smoke would be dispersed by the wind rather than rising in a telltale column. A depression in the rock showed where a sleeping area had been carved out and lined with pine boughs. Most tellingly, a series of small holes had been drilled into the rock face to hold wooden stakes, the kind of improvised system a man might use to hang tarps for weather protection or camouflage. "They lived here," Eli said wonderingly, running his hand along the smooth depression where countless nights of sleep had worn away the stone's rough edges. "For weeks, maybe months. The evidence painted a picture of people in hiding, people who had the woodcraft skills to survive in the wilderness, but who couldn't risk returning to civilization. Caleb would have had those skills. Their father had taught both boys to live off the land during their childhood camping trips. But why would he have needed to use them? Boone was investigating the far end of the shelf, where the rock formation created a natural alcove that would have provided additional shelter. Suddenly, the dog began barking, not his usual warning bark, but the excited sound he made when he'd found something particularly interesting. Eli hurried over to see what had caught Boone's attention and found himself looking at a cache of supplies that had been carefully hidden behind loose rocks. Canned goods with labels faded by time and weather, a small camping stove, and a water container that still held a few inches of liquid that had somehow escaped evaporation. But most significant was a notebook wrapped in oiled cloth, its pages filled with Caleb's familiar handwriting. Eli opened it carefully, afraid that the aged paper might crumble at his touch, and found himself reading his brother's record of life on the run. Day 12 in the canyon. Maria is holding up better than I expected, but Miguel is starting to ask questions about when we can go home. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that home might not exist anymore? That the people we're running from have the kind of reach that can find us anywhere we try to make a normal life? The sheriff was dirty. We know that for certain now. When Maria tried to report what she'd seen back in Arizona, Morrison made it clear that her testimony wasn't welcome. Said she was probably mistaken about what she'd witnessed. Suggested it might be healthier for her and the boy if they found somewhere else to live. But we couldn't just leave. Maria had seen them bury that federal agent, seen the mining company executives standing over the grave like they were discussing the weather. We're the only witnesses to murder, and that makes us liabilities that can't be allowed to walk away. Tomorrow, we move to the next camp. The map shows 3 more hiding spots deeper in the canyons, places where we can stay invisible until we figure out how to get word to someone in federal law enforcement who isn't on the mining company's payroll. Maria thinks we should try to reach her cousin in Denver, but I'm not sure we can trust anyone right now. I keep thinking about Eli, wondering if he's noticed the cattle missing from the north pasture yet. Probably thinks I finally stole something from him, just like he always expected I would. Maybe that's better than the truth. Maybe it's better if he thinks I'm just a thief instead of a dead man. Eli closed the notebook with shaking hands, finally understanding the full scope of what his brother had been facing. Caleb hadn't just been protecting Maria and Miguel. He'd been trying to expose a conspiracy that reached from corporate boardrooms to the sheriff's office. And he'd died for it, but died where? And why had this notebook been left behind when they moved to the next hiding place? Boone's low growl interrupted his thoughts, a sound that raised the hair on the back of Eli's neck. The dog was staring toward the canyon mouth, his body tense and ready for flight or fight. Something was out there, something that didn't belong in this remote wilderness. Eli moved quickly to the edge of the shelf and pulled out his binoculars, scanning the trail they'd just traveled. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of red rock and sparse vegetation that had remained unchanged for centuries. Then a glint of reflected light caught his eye. Coming from a position that offered a clear view of their current location, someone was watching them. Someone with equipment sophisticated enough to track their movements from a considerable distance. And if they were being watched now, that meant their investigation had attracted the attention of people who preferred to keep the past buried. Time to go. Boone, Eli said quietly, gathering up the notebook and map while keeping one eye on the distant watcher. We've learned enough for one day. But as they prepared to leave the hidden campsite, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. 30 years after Caleb's death, the same forces that had silenced his brother were stirring again. And this time, an aging cowboy and his faithful dog were the ones in the crosshairs. The descent from the hidden campsite required all of Eli's attention, but he couldn't shake the feeling of invisible eyes tracking their every move. Boone stayed close to Buck's hooves, no longer ranging ahead as he usually did, his body language broadcasting the same tension that Eli felt in his own shoulders. They were being hunted, and the hunters had a significant advantage in both numbers and modern equipment. But Eli had something his pursuers lacked: intimate knowledge of country that had been his playground, his workplace, and his sanctuary for more than 6 decades. If it came to a test of wilderness survival, he was confident that age and experience would triumph over youth and technology. The second X mark on Caleb's bark map led to a narrow slot canyon that Eli remembered exploring as a boy. The entrance was so well hidden that you could ride past it a dozen times without noticing the gap in the rock wall. Inside, the canyon twisted and turned for several hundred yards before opening into a circular chamber that had been carved by thousands of years of flash floods. Eli had to leave Buck at the entrance. The passage was too narrow for a horse, and continue on foot with only Boone for company. The silence inside the slot canyon was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rock formations, and the soft scrape of their footsteps on the sandy floor. The chamber at the end of the passage was exactly as Eli remembered it from his childhood adventures, a natural cathedral with walls that soared toward a narrow slice of sky visible far overhead. But now it held secrets that transformed the magical place of his youth into something darker and more complex. Someone had carved a series of shallow niches into the rock wall, each one carefully sized to hold specific items. Most of the niches were empty now, but one still contained a bundle wrapped in the same kind of oiled cloth that had protected Caleb's notebook. Eli's hands trembled as he unwrapped it, revealing a collection of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The letters were written on paper that had once been white, but had yellowed with age, each one carefully folded and addressed in different handwritings. Some were signed Caleb in his brother's familiar script, while others bore the signature Maria in a more delicate feminine hand. Love letters preserved in this hidden sanctuary, like pressed flowers in a family Bible. Eli hesitated before opening the first letter, knowing that he was about to intrude on the most private moments of his brother's life. But the need to understand what had happened to Caleb and his family overrode his sense of propriety. These letters might contain the key to solving a 30-year-old mystery. The first letter was from Maria to Caleb, dated just 2 weeks after his brother had left the ranch in anger. My dearest Caleb, I cannot stop thinking about our conversation last night. When you told me about your brother, about the argument that drove you away from your home, I saw such pain in your eyes. But I also saw hope, and that gives me courage to write what I have been afraid to say. I love you. I know we have only known each other for a few short weeks, but my heart has never been more certain of anything. You are kind and gentle with Miguel, patient with my fears, and you make me believe that it is possible to build a new life from the ashes of an old one. I must tell you something that may change how you feel about me. I'm carrying a child, your child. I had planned to wait, to be certain of your feelings before sharing this news, but I cannot bear to keep this secret any longer. If you choose to leave, I will understand. A man has the right to choose his own path, and I will not use this baby to trap you into a life you do not want. But if you choose to stay, if you choose to love us both, then I promise you will never regret it. Miguel already asks when Senor Caleb will visit again, and I dream of a future where we are a real family. All my love, Maria. Eli blinked back tears as he folded the letter with infinite care. Maria's words painted a picture of vulnerability and hope that made his brother's response all the more poignant. Caleb's reply, written just 3 days later, revealed the depth of his transformation from angry young man to devoted father-to-be. My beautiful Maria, your letter made me weep with joy. A child, our child. I've walked these canyons for hours, thinking about what kind of father I want to be, what kind of life I want to build for our family. I will not be like my own father, good man though he was, who believed that love was something to be earned through hard work and sacrifice. Our children will know every day that they are cherished, that their dreams matter more than land or cattle or any of the things that men usually kill themselves trying to acquire. We will marry as soon as possible, and I will adopt Miguel legally so that he bears my name and has all the rights of my natural son. He is a fine boy, Maria, and I am honored to help raise him. Together, we will give him the kind of childhood that teaches a boy he can become anything he chooses to be. I have saved enough money to buy us passage to Colorado, where your cousin lives. We can start fresh there, away from the shadows of both our pasts. I will find work. We will rent a small house with a garden where you can grow the flowers you love. and we will build the kind of life that exists only in dreams. I love you more than I ever thought possible to love another person. You and Miguel and our unborn child are my family now, my real family. The family of my heart rather than my blood, forever yours. Caleb, the letters continued for several months, chronicling the development of their relationship and their growing plans for the future. Eli learned that Maria had been working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Arizona before fleeing north with Miguel. She'd left that job abruptly after witnessing something that had terrified her. Though the early letters contained only vague references to the bad men and what I saw in the desert, it wasn't until the final letters in the collection that the true nature of Maria's danger became clear. Caleb's handwriting grew increasingly urgent as he described their attempts to evade pursuit. Maria, my darling, we cannot wait any longer. The men who came to the diner asking questions about you were not federal agents, no matter what badges they carried. Rosie described them to me, and I recognized the type. Private security, the kind that mining companies hire when they need problems to disappear permanently. We leave tonight. I have found a place where we can hide while we decide our next move. A system of canyons near my family's ranch where I played as a boy. The land is rough and trackless, impossible to search unless you know exactly where to look. We can survive there for as long as necessary. I have prepared supply caches and marked the locations on a map that I will hide with our other precious things. If something happens to me, if we are separated, follow the map to the caves where I have stored food and water. Wait for me there, and I will find you no matter how long it takes. Do not trust the local sheriff. He is part of this conspiracy, bought and paid for by the same people who want you silenced. Our only hope is to gather enough evidence to take to federal authorities in Denver or Salt Lake City. Men who are beyond the reach of mining company money. I know you are frightened, and I wish I could promise that everything will be all right. But I can promise that I will die before I let them hurt you or Miguel or our baby. You are my life now, Maria, and I will protect that life with my last breath, all my love always. Caleb. The final letter in the collection was heartbreaking in its brevity. Caleb, my love, they have found our first hiding place. We heard the helicopters this morning, and Miguel saw men with guns climbing the canyon walls. We are moving to the cave you showed me, the one with the drawings on the walls. If you are reading this, it means we did not make it. Tell our baby that we loved him, that we died trying to give him a chance at a free life. And know that my last thought was of your smile, your gentle hands, your beautiful heart. Forever, Maria. Eli's hands shook as he refolded the letters and retied them with the blue ribbon. The timeline was clear now. Maria and Miguel had been hunted down like animals, and Caleb had died trying to protect them. But where were their bodies? And why had some of their belongings been hidden, while others were left at the wagon site? Boone's sharp bark echoed off the canyon walls, a warning that sent adrenaline flooding through Eli's bloodstream. The dog was facing the slot canyon entrance, his hackles raised and his lips pulled back in a silent snarl. Someone was coming, and Boone's body language suggested it wasn't a friendly visit. Eli quickly rewrapped the letters and tucked them inside his jacket, then checked to make sure his rifle was loaded and ready. The natural chamber offered excellent defensive positions, high ground, limited approaches, and rock walls that would stop most bullets. If their pursuers wanted a fight, they'd chosen the wrong place to start one. But as he settled into a defensive position behind a boulder, Eli realized that the immediate danger was less important than the larger truth he'd uncovered. Caleb hadn't been just another victim of corporate greed and official corruption. He'd been a man who'd found love, purpose, and a reason to live that transcended his own comfort and safety, and somewhere in these canyons, the people responsible for destroying that love were still walking free, still profiting from the blood they'd spilled to protect their secrets. 30 years of silence was long enough. It was time for the truth to see daylight, no matter what the cost. The footsteps in the slot canyon were trying to be quiet, but the narrow rock walls amplified every sound. Eli counted at least 2 sets of boots, moving with the careful deliberation of men who expected trouble. Boone's growl had dropped to a barely audible rumble. the kind of sound that promised violence if the approaching strangers proved hostile. Eli positioned himself behind a natural parapet of stone, his rifle aimed at the canyon entrance. The approaching men would be silhouetted against the afternoon sky when they emerged into the chamber, giving him a significant tactical advantage. But he hoped it wouldn't come to shooting. At his age, with his arthritic joints and failing eyesight, he wasn't sure he could handle multiple opponents in a sustained firefight. "Mr. Brandt." The voice that echoed off the canyon walls was young, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "This is Deputy Jake Morrison with the Garfield County Sheriff's Department. We'd like to have a word with you, Morrison." The name hit Eli like a physical blow, bringing with it memories of Sheriff Wade Morrison's heavy-handed tactics and rumored connections to the mining companies that had dominated local politics 30 years ago. If this was Wade's son, then Eli's investigation had attracted exactly the kind of attention he'd been hoping to avoid. "Come on out where we can see you," Eli called back, keeping his rifle trained on the canyon entrance. "Keep your hands visible and move slow." Two men emerged from the slot canyon, both wearing the tan uniforms of the sheriff's department. The younger one, Deputy Morrison presumably, was in his early 30s, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that suggested military service. His partner was older, heavier, with the cynical eyes of a man who'd seen too much of the world's ugliness. "We're here about the missing cattle report," Morrison said, his hands raised in a gesture of peaceful intent. "Rancher down in the valley said he'd seen your herd wandering loose near Devil's Canyon. Thought you might be tracking them?" It was a plausible story, the kind of routine call that county deputies handled all the time. But something about Morrison's posture, the way his partner kept scanning the canyon walls as if looking for additional threats. He told Eli that cattle weren't really why they'd come. "Cattle are back home safe," Eli replied, not lowering his rifle. "Has been since yesterday afternoon. Seems like you boys made a long trip for nothing." Morrison's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's good to hear. Mind if we ask what you're doing way up here in the canyons? This is pretty remote country for a man your age to be wandering around alone. Free country, last I checked. Man's got a right to ride his own land without answering to every badge-wearing stranger who comes along." The older deputy, his name tag read Henderson, stepped slightly to the side, a movement that would give him a better angle if the situation turned violent. "Now, Mr. Brandt, there's no need for hostility. We're just doing our job, making sure everything's all right." But Eli had noticed something that made his blood run cold. Henderson was carrying more than the standard deputy's sidearm. There was a bulge under his left arm that suggested a concealed weapon, and his boots were the kind of heavy-duty tactical gear favored by military contractors and private security firms. These men weren't county deputies responding to a routine call. They were hunters, and Eli was their prey. "Boone," he said quietly, and the dog immediately began moving toward a position that would allow him to attack from the side if necessary. "Good boy." Morrison noticed the dog's movement, and his hand drifted toward his holster. "Mr. Brandt, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We're not your enemies. In fact, we might be able to help each other." "Help each other how?" "Well, for instance, we could help you understand why it's dangerous for an old man to go poking around in places where he doesn't belong. And you could help us by forgetting about whatever you think you found up here." The mask was coming off now, the pretense of official business dissolving into naked threat. Eli's finger tightened on his rifle's trigger as he calculated angles and distances. He was outnumbered, but he had better cover and the advantage of knowing the terrain. "Suppose I'm not interested in that kind of help." Henderson laughed, a sound like gravel grinding under boot heels. "Then you might find yourself having the same kind of accident that befell your brother 30 years ago. Funny thing about these canyons, a man can fall into a hole and never be found." It was a confession and a threat rolled into one sentence. These men knew what had happened to Caleb, which meant they were either directly involved or working for the people who were. Either way, Eli was now a witness who had learned too much for his own safety. "My brother didn't fall into any hole," Eli said quietly. "He was murdered, along with his wife and stepson." Morrison's face went very still. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man. And you're about to make a very serious mistake. The only mistake I made was waiting 30 years to start asking questions. The shooting started when Henderson went for his concealed weapon. Eli's first shot took the older deputy center mass, spinning him around and dropping him behind a boulder. Morrison drew his sidearm with impressive speed, but Boone was already in motion, launching himself across the chamber in a snarling projectile of teeth and fury. The deputy's shot went wide as 60 pounds of angry dog crashed into his chest, driving him backward toward the canyon wall. Morrison screamed as Boone's jaws found his gun arm, the weapon clattering away across the stone floor. Eli kept his rifle trained on Henderson's position, waiting to see if the wounded man would continue the fight. But Henderson was down for good, his body motionless behind the boulder where he'd fallen. The spreading pool of blood told Eli everything he needed to know about the older deputy's condition. Morrison was still screaming as Boone maintained his grip on the man's arm. But the quality of the screams had changed from anger to pure terror.
"Call him off!
Christ, call him off! Boone, release. The dog immediately let go and backed away, his teeth still bared but his attack controlled. Years of training had taught him to respond instantly to Eli's commands, even in the heat of combat. Morrison clutched his mangled arm and stared up at Eli with eyes bright with pain and fear. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This is bigger than just some old murders. There are people involved who won't hesitate to what? Kill an old cowboy and his dog? Eli kept the rifle pointed at Morrison's chest while he searched the deputy's pockets. Seems to me like that's exactly what you came here to do. In Morrison's shirt pocket, Eli found something that made his blood freeze. It was a sheriff's badge, tarnished and bent as if it had been damaged in some kind of struggle. But it wasn't Morrison's current badge. This one was older, heavier, with the kind of craftsmanship that hadn't been used in decades. Eli turned the badge over and found an inscription on the back. Sheriff W. Morrison, 1975-2001. Faithful service to Garfield County. Wade Morrison's badge. The corrupt sheriff who had been in power when Caleb and his family disappeared. And now it was being carried by his son, like some kind of trophy or talisman. This belonged to your father, Eli said, holding up the badge so Morrison could see it. The younger man's face went pale. You don't know anything about my father. I know he was a murderer. I know he killed my brother and his family to protect the mining companies that were paying him off. And I know you're following in his footsteps, Morrison laughed bitterly. My father was a patriot who understood that sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Those people your brother was protecting, they were trying to destroy an operation that brings millions of dollars into this county every year. Thousands of jobs, Mr. Brandt, schools and hospitals and roads that wouldn't exist without the mining revenue. And that justified murder? It justified protecting the community from people who would have destroyed it for their own selfish ends. Eli stared at the badge in his hand, seeing in its tarnished surface the reflection of 30 years of unanswered questions. This piece of metal represented everything he'd lost when Caleb disappeared. Not just his brother, but the chance for reconciliation, for forgiveness, for the kind of relationship that only brothers could share. Now he had a choice to make. He could take Morrison prisoner, try to force him to reveal the location of Caleb's remains, and hope that somehow justice could still be served after 3 decades. Or he could walk away, return to his quiet life on the ranch, and let the dead stay buried. But as he looked at Morrison's sneering face, at Henderson's body bleeding onto the ancient stone, at Boone standing guard with the patience of a loyal soldier, Eli knew there was really no choice at all. Caleb had died fighting for the truth. The least his older brother could do was finish what Caleb had started. You're going to tell me where they're buried, Eli said quietly. All of them. And then you're going to help me make sure the people responsible pay for what they did. Morrison spat blood onto the canyon floor. Go to hell, old man. You have no idea what you're up against. But Eli had faced down rustlers, survived blizzards that had killed lesser men, and buried the only woman he'd ever loved. Whatever forces had killed his brother 30 years ago, he was no longer the young man who'd been too proud and too frightened to fight for his family. This time, he wouldn't back down. Morrison's radio crackled to life before Eli could press him for more information. The voice that emerged from the static was older, more authoritative, with the kind of confidence that came from years of giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "Jake, what's your status?" "Henderson should have checked in 10 minutes ago." Morrison looked at his mangled arm, then at Henderson's motionless body, then at the rifle that Eli kept trained on his chest. "We've got a situation here, Mr. Kellerman. The old man was ready for us." "Define situation, Deputy." "Henderson's down. The target is armed and has taken a defensive position. We need backup." There was a long pause before Kellerman's voice returned, colder now and stripped of any pretense of official authority. "Negative on backup, Jake. Clean up your mess and get back to base. We can't afford any more complications." Eli saw the exact moment when Morrison realized he'd been abandoned by his employers. The young deputy's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, fear. And finally, the bitter acceptance of a man who just learned that his loyalty meant nothing to the people he'd been serving. "They're cutting you loose," Eli observed quietly, "just like they did your father when his usefulness expired." Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. "You think my father died of natural causes? Heart attack at 58, perfectly healthy man? They killed him when the federal investigation got too close, made it look like stress from the job. It was another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Reed Morrison hadn't retired in disgrace. He'd been silenced permanently when he became a liability to his corporate masters. And now his son was learning the same hard lesson about the price of serving interests that viewed human life as just another business expense. "Help me understand what really happened," Eli said, lowering his rifle slightly, but keeping it ready. "Help me find my brother's body and the truth about why he died. Do that and maybe we both walk out of this canyon alive." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options with the careful calculation of a man who'd just realized that his previous life was over, regardless of what choice he made. Finally, he nodded toward Henderson's body. "Check his pack. There's something in there that explains everything, something they didn't want you to find, but something you need to see if you're going to understand what you're really dealing with." Eli kept one eye on Morrison while he searched through Henderson's equipment. The pack contained the usual law enforcement gear: extra ammunition, first aid supplies, radio batteries. But tucked into a waterproof pouch was a manila folder that felt far too important for a routine patrol. Inside the folder were surveyor's maps, geological reports, and mining company assessments that dated back more than 40 years. The documents were marked with corporate logos that Eli recognized: Consolidated Western Mining, the same company that had been quietly buying up mineral rights throughout the region since the 1970s. But it wasn't just the company name that made his blood run cold. It was the specific plots of land that had been surveyed, assessed, and ultimately targeted for mineral extraction. According to the documents, the entire area where Caleb's wagon had been hidden sat on top of one of the richest uranium deposits ever discovered in the western United States. "Sweet Jesus," Eli breathed, studying the geological maps with growing understanding. They weren't just covering up corruption. They were stealing land. Morrison nodded grimly. 40 years of carefully orchestrated theft. "Mr. Brandt, your brother stumbled onto something that could have destroyed the entire operation." The documents painted a picture of conspiracy that reached from corporate boardrooms to sheriff's offices to federal agencies. Consolidated Western had been using a network of corrupt officials to suppress geological surveys, intimidate property owners, and eliminate anyone who threatened, to expose their systematic theft of mineral rights. Land that should have made its owners wealthy beyond imagination had been acquired for pennies, on the dollar, through a combination of legal manipulation, outright fraud, and, when necessary, murder. The company's profits over 4 decades had been built on a foundation of stolen resources and spilled blood. But why kill Maria and Miguel? Eli asked, his voice thick with emotion. They weren't landowners. They weren't threats to the mining operation. Because Maria had worked as a housekeeper for Thomas Kellerman, the company's regional director, Morrison explained. She'd seen documents, overheard phone conversations, witnessed meetings that proved the whole conspiracy. When she tried to report what she'd learned to federal authorities, Kellerman realized she had to be silenced, and Caleb got caught in the middle. Your brother tried to protect them. He thought he could hide them in the canyons until the heat died down, maybe get them safely out of the state. But Kellerman had too much invested in keeping those secrets buried. He used my father's resources to hunt them down, like animals. The radio crackled again, Kellerman's voice sharp with impatience. Jake, what's taking so long? We've got a board meeting in 3 hours, and I need this situation resolved. Morrison stared at the radio for a moment, then made a decision that would change everything. Mr. Kellerman, this is Deputy Jake Morrison, officially informing you that I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, theft of mineral rights, and corruption of public officials. The silence that followed was so complete that Eli could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. When Kellerman finally responded, his voice carried the cold fury of a man who'd just been betrayed by someone he'd considered completely under his control. You've made a very serious mistake. Jake, your father learned what happens to people who forget where their loyalties lie. My father was murdered by the same people who killed Caleb Brandt and his family. And I'm done being part of it. Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind that law enforcement used to document interviews and confessions. Everything we've said here has been recorded, Mr. Brandt. Every admission, every threat, every piece of evidence we've discussed. Eli stared at the recorder, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. You've been recording this whole conversation? From the moment Henderson and I entered the canyon, I've been gathering evidence against Kellerman and his operation for months, trying to build a case that would stand up in federal court. I just needed something to break the conspiracy open, some piece of evidence that would make it impossible for them to deny their crimes. And my brother's case is that evidence? Your brother's case is the key to everything. The documents in that folder prove that Consolidated Western has been systematically stealing mineral rights for 40 years. But without witness testimony about specific murders, it's just a financial crime. With your brother's story, it becomes a conspiracy that includes multiple homicides. Morrison struggled to his feet, cradling his injured arm against his chest. But we need to move fast. Kellerman will have more people on the way. Real killers this time. Not county deputies who might have second thoughts about murder. As if summoned by his words, the sound of helicopter rotors began echoing off the canyon walls. The aircraft was still distant, but it was approaching fast, and with the kind of purposeful flight pattern that suggested the pilot knew exactly where he was going. They've been tracking us, Morrison said grimly. Probably had surveillance on this whole area for weeks, waiting to see if anyone would come looking for answers about the old murders. Eli gathered up the mining documents and stuffed them into his jacket, his mind racing through possible escape routes. The slot canyon would offer some protection from aerial surveillance, but it was also a potential trap if Kellerman's people managed to block the entrance. How many men will he send? Eli asked as they prepared to move. Enough to make sure there are no survivors this time. Kellerman spent 40 years covering up these crimes. He's not going to let an old cowboy and a rogue deputy destroy everything he's built. The helicopter sound was getting closer, joined now by the distant rumble of heavy vehicles approaching on the canyon rim. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and facing opponents who had both superior firepower and the resources of a multinational corporation behind them. But they also had something their enemies lacked: the truth, documented and recorded, ready to be transmitted to federal authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated. All they had to do was survive long enough to get that evidence into the right hands. There's a ranger station about 15 miles north of here, Morrison said as they began moving toward the canyon entrance. Federal land, federal jurisdiction. If we can reach it, Eli interrupted, checking his rifle one more time. That's a mighty big word when you're dealing with people who've already killed to protect their secrets. Boone appeared at his side. The dog's ears pricked forward as he tracked the approaching sounds of pursuit. The old blue healer might not understand the complexities of corporate conspiracy and mineral rights theft, But he understood loyalty, protection, and the bond between a man and his family. 30 years after Caleb's death, that bond was finally strong enough to demand justice. The question was whether Eli and his unlikely allies would live long enough to deliver it. The helicopter had landed somewhere on the canyon rim, its rotors winding down to silence that felt more ominous than the mechanical thunder of its approach. Eli counted at least 2 more vehicles arriving, their engines echoing off the red rock walls like the growl of hunting predators circling wounded prey. "They're setting up a perimeter," Morrison said, pressing his back against the canyon wall and trying to control the bleeding from his mangled arm. "Standard search and destroy protocol. They'll work their way down from the rim, sealing off escape routes as they go." Eli studied the approaching dusk with the calculating eye of a man who'd spent his life reading weather, terrain, and the behavior of wild animals. Darkness would give them some advantage. He knew these canyons better than any outsider ever could, and Boone's senses were far superior to any night vision equipment the corporate killers might have brought. But darkness was still hours away, and they needed sanctuary now. "There's a place," Eli said slowly, memory pulling him back to adventures shared with his brother more than 50 years ago. "Caleb and I used to call it the Fort. Hidden cave system about a mile north of here, accessible only through an underwater passage that most grown men couldn't navigate." Morrison looked skeptical. "Underwater? With this arm, I'm not sure I could." "You won't have to. There's a dry approach if you know where to look, but it requires climbing skills and absolute trust in your partner. Caleb and I discovered it when we were boys, and we swore we'd never tell another living soul." The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to violate a childhood oath to his brother in order to honor a much deeper promise to seek justice for Caleb's murder. But he suspected that his brother would understand, would approve of using their secret sanctuary as a base of operations for exposing the truth. They moved carefully through the slot canyon, Boone ranging ahead to provide early warning of any ambush. The dog's behavior had changed subtly. Instead of the nervous alertness he'd shown earlier, he now displayed the focused intensity of a working animal with a specific mission. It was as if he understood that they were no longer fleeing but preparing to fight. The entrance to the fort was exactly as Eli remembered it, a narrow crack in the canyon wall, hidden behind a screen of dead juniper branches that looked completely natural unless you knew what to look for. The opening was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, and the passage beyond twisted and climbed through solid rock for almost 100 yards before opening into the cavern that had been his and Caleb's childhood refuge. Morrison struggled with the climb, weakened by blood loss and hampered by his injured arm, but he managed to follow Eli through the tortuous passage without complaint. When they finally emerged into the cavern, both men were breathing hard and covered with rock dust, but they were also completely hidden from any external surveillance. The fort was larger than Eli remembered, though that might have been a trick of memory colored by childhood perspective. The cavern extended back into the mountain for several hundred feet, with multiple chambers connected by natural passages that provided excellent defensive positions. Most importantly, there were several exits, including the underwater route that led to a hidden pool almost a mile away. But it was what he found in the deepest chamber that made Eli's hands shake with emotion. Someone had been here recently. Not Morrison's people or corporate killers, but someone who knew about the fort's existence and significance. Someone who had left a message specifically for Eli to find. The message was carved into the rock wall in Caleb's distinctive handwriting, the letters carefully formed despite the crude tools that had been used to create them. Below the inscription was a metal ammunition box, the kind they'd used as boys to store their most precious treasures. "What does it say?" Morrison asked, playing his flashlight over the carved words. Eli's voice was thick with emotion as he read his brother's final message aloud. "For Eli, who taught me that family means never giving up on the people you love, even when they disappoint you. The truth is in the box. Use it wisely. Use it well. Your brother always, CJB." Inside the ammunition box was a testament that took Eli's breath away, dozens of pages of handwritten notes. photographs and documents that Caleb had somehow managed to gather during his final weeks of life. It was a complete record of the conspiracy that had killed him, meticulously researched and carefully organized for maximum legal impact. The first page was a letter addressed directly to Eli, written in his brother's familiar script. "My dear brother, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and I am no longer alive to protect the people I love. But death is not the end of responsibility, and I have spent my final days gathering the evidence that will ensure justice is served. Even if I am not here to see it, I know you think I abandoned our family, abandoned the ranch, abandoned everything that should have mattered to a man with Brant blood in his veins. But I have learned that there are different kinds of family, different ways to honor the legacy our father left us. Sometimes protecting what you love means sacrificing what you want. Sometimes being a man means accepting that you might not live to see your children grow up. Maria is pregnant with our child, Eli, a son, if the doctor is right. I had planned to name him James, after our father, and to raise him on the land that has been our family's heritage for 4 generations. But that future has been stolen from us by men who value profit more than human life. The evidence in this box will destroy them if it reaches the right hands. Federal agents who cannot be bought, prosecutors who cannot be intimidated, judges who still believe that justice matters more than corporate influence. But getting that evidence to the right people will require courage, sacrifice, and the kind of stubborn determination that has always been the Brant family's greatest strength. I failed to protect my family. Eli, I failed to see the danger in time, failed to understand the reach of the people we were fighting. But you can succeed where I failed. You can ensure that our deaths have meaning, that other families will not suffer as ours has suffered. In the pages that follow, you will find the complete record of Consolidated Western Mining's criminal conspiracy. Names, dates, financial records, witness statements, everything needed to bring down an operation that has murdered innocent people and stolen millions of dollars in mineral rights over 4 decades. But be warned, brother, these people will kill you without hesitation if they discover what you know. They have corrupted local law enforcement, bought federal officials, and created a network of violence that reaches from corporate boardrooms to street-level assassins. Trust no one in local government. Trust no one who claims to represent mining interests. Trust only federal agents who can be verified through official channels. Most importantly, know that I forgave you long ago for the harsh words that drove me away from home. You were young, frightened, and trying to protect the only life you'd ever known. I was young, restless, and too proud to see that your anger came from love rather than hatred. We were both fools, Eli, but we were fools who loved each other despite our foolishness. That love is stronger than death, stronger than corporate greed, stronger than the fear that has kept these crimes hidden for 30 years. Find our bodies, brother. Give us proper burial. Speak our names so that people will remember we lived, we loved, and we died fighting for something larger than ourselves, and know that my last thought, as I write these words in the darkness of this cave, while killers search the canyons for my family, is of our father's voice telling us that Brant men never back down from a fight, especially when the fight is for family. Use this evidence well. Make them pay. Your loving brother, Caleb James Brant, October 15, 1995. Eli had to stop reading for several minutes, overwhelmed by the weight of his brother's love, trust, and sacrifice. Caleb had spent his final days not in despair, but in methodical preparation for a justice he would never live to see. It was an act of faith that demanded an equally powerful response. The documents that followed Caleb's letter were devastating in their thoroughness. His brother had somehow managed to photograph financial records, record conversations, and document meetings that proved the scope of Consolidated Western's criminal conspiracy. There were bank statements showing payments to corrupt officials, geological surveys that had been deliberately suppressed, and most damning of all, recorded conversations between company executives discussing the necessity of eliminating witnesses. One conversation, recorded just days before Caleb's death, was particularly chilling. The woman and her boy have to disappear permanently. said a voice that sounded like Thomas Kellerman. "No bodies, no evidence, no questions from federal authorities. Make it look like they fled to Mexico. What about the cowboy?" Asked another voice. "Sheriff Wade Morrison. He's a complication we didn't anticipate. But he's also a solution. Local man dies trying to protect helpless refugees from drug cartel violence. Very tragic, very believable. The kind of story that discourages further investigation, and if someone comes looking for him later, then they meet the same fate. This operation has generated over $200 million in profit over the past 20 years. Wade, that's worth protecting at any cost, Eli felt rage building in his chest as he listened to these men discussing his brother's murder with the casual indifference they might show when planning a weekend hunting trip. But alongside the rage was something more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that demanded not just vengeance, but complete justice. "Morrison," he said quietly, showing the deputy the recording device. "Your father wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was a full partner in multiple murders." Morrison's face had gone pale as he listened to the recorded conversation. "I knew he was dirty, but I never imagined. Christ, they planned it all out like a business transaction. And now Kellerman's planning to do the same thing to us," Eli observed. "Which means we have one advantage he doesn't expect." "What's that?" "We know exactly how he thinks, how he operates, how he's going to try to kill us." Eli began organizing Caleb's evidence into a portable package, his mind already working through the tactical implications of what they'd learned. "He's going to stage our deaths to look like something other than corporate murder. Probably an accident, maybe a dispute between locals that got out of hand. So how do we use that against him?" Eli smiled grimly, feeling for the first time in 30 years the kind of fierce joy that came from having a clear mission and the tools to accomplish it. "We give him exactly what he expects, right up until the moment we turn his own plan against him." Boone whined softly and pressed against Eli's leg, offering the wordless support that had sustained them both through years of loss and loneliness. But now they weren't alone anymore. They had allies, not just Morrison, but the ghost of Caleb himself, reaching across 3 decades to provide the weapons needed for this final battle. Outside the cavern, night was falling over the canyons, and somewhere in that darkness, corporate killers were positioning themselves for what they thought would be a simple elimination mission. They had no idea that they were walking into a trap set by 2 brothers who had learned, too late, but not too late to matter, that love was indeed stronger than death. The attack came at midnight. Exactly as Eli had predicted, he'd positioned himself at the cavern's main entrance, using Caleb's 30-year-old intelligence about Kellerman's operational patterns to anticipate exactly how the corporate killers would approach their target. They were professionals, but they were professionals who had grown accustomed to eliminating helpless witnesses rather than facing opponents who might fight back. Morrison crouched behind a natural barrier deeper in the cave, his injured arm bound with strips torn from his shirt and his service weapon ready for the fight that would either clear his father's name or bury him alongside the family legacy of corruption. The digital recorder in his pocket contained enough evidence to destroy Consolidated, Western's entire operation, if they survived long enough to deliver it to federal authorities. Boone lay absolutely still at Eli's side, every muscle tensed for action, but his breathing controlled and silent. The old dog had faced down coyotes, rattlesnakes, and angry bulls during his years on the ranch. But tonight he was facing something more dangerous than any wild animal, human predators who killed for profit rather than survival. The first sign of attack was almost invisible, a tiny red dot of laser light that swept across the cavern entrance like a lethal firefly. Eli had seen similar devices during his brief military service 40 years ago, though the technology had obviously improved since then. Modern killers use modern tools, but they were still constrained by the same tactical realities that had governed warfare since the first cave dweller picked up a rock. "They're using thermal imaging," Morrison whispered. "Military-grade equipment. We're outgunned and outmanned." "Maybe," Eli replied quietly, his finger resting lightly on his rifle's trigger. "But we're not outthought. And we're fighting on our home ground. The assault began with a flashbang grenade that detonated just inside the cavern entrance, filling the space with blinding light and deafening noise. It was exactly the kind of overwhelming force that professionals used to disorient their targets before moving in for quick kills, but Eli had closed his eyes and covered his ears the moment he saw the grenade's distinctive shape silhouetted against the night sky. When the explosion faded, he was ready for the three armed figures who came charging through the entrance, expecting to find their victims helpless and confused. His first shot took the lead attacker center mass, dropping the man with the kind of clean precision that came from a lifetime of hunting. The second shot went wide as Boone launched himself at the next assassin. 60 pounds of fury and fangs that transformed a tactical entry into chaos. The third killer managed to get off several shots before Morrison's return fire drove him back toward the entrance. But the narrow confines of the cavern worked against the attackers rather than the defenders. Superior numbers meant nothing when you could only advance through a choke point barely wide enough for one man at a time. "Fall back to position 2, Eli called, implementing the defensive plan they'd worked out during the long hours of waiting. "Boone, come." They retreated deeper into the cavern, using the twisted passages that Eli and Caleb had explored as children to stay ahead of their pursuers. The attackers followed, but cautiously now, having learned that their targets were neither helpless nor unprepared. The second defensive position was a natural amphitheater where multiple passages converged, offering excellent fields of fire and several escape routes. Eli had positioned additional ammunition and supplies here hours earlier, along with something that would turn the hunters into the hunted. Morrison was bleeding again, the stress of combat having reopened his arm wound, but his shooting was steady and accurate. "How many more of them?" He gasped between shots. "Doesn't matter," Eli replied, pulling out a device he'd taken from one of Caleb's evidence caches. "Because we're about to even the odds." The device looked like an ordinary smartphone, but Morrison recognized it as something far more sophisticated. A military-grade communication intercept unit, the kind that federal agencies use to monitor criminal organizations. Caleb had somehow acquired it during his investigation, and now it was about to prove that the conspiracy extended far beyond the events of 30 years ago. Eli activated the device and immediately began picking up radio chatter from the attacking force. The conversations he heard made his blood run cold. "Target is more resourceful than anticipated. We've lost Thompson and Martinez is down with severe dog bites. Copy that. Mr. Kellerman wants this wrapped up by 0200 hours. Use whatever force is necessary." Understood. "What about collateral damage?" "There won't be any collateral damage because there won't be any survivors. Burn the whole cave system if you have to, but make sure nothing walks out of there alive." But it was the next exchange that provided the evidence Morrison needed to complete his case against the company. "Sir, what about the Morrison problem? The deputy's family has been useful, but his recent behavior suggests Jake Morrison dies with the others. His father outlived his usefulness, and so has he. We'll blame the whole thing on a drug cartel dispute that got out of hand." Morrison's face went white as he heard his own death sentence pronounced with casual indifference. "They killed my father, and now they're planning to kill me." "Welcome to the family business," Eli said grimly, ejecting the device's memory card and handing it to Morrison. "But now we have proof of ongoing criminal conspiracy recorded less than an hour ago. That makes this a current federal case, not just a cold case investigation." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cavern passages, accompanied by the low hum of electronic equipment. The attackers were bringing up heavier weapons, probably planning to use explosive charges to collapse the defensive positions rather than risk more casualties in direct assault. "Time to go," Eli said, gathering up Caleb's evidence files and heading toward the cavern's deepest passage. "There's an exit back here that leads to the underground river. They can blow up this section or we'll be long gone." The escape route was everything Eli remembered from childhood. Adventures, a narrow tunnel that dropped almost vertically, before opening into an underground waterway that had carved its path through the mountain over millions of years. The water was shockingly cold, but it was also their salvation. Boone dove into the dark water without hesitation, his powerful legs carrying him through the current with the confidence of a dog who'd swum countless ranch ponds and irrigation ditches. Morrison followed more reluctantly, gasping at the cold, but managing to keep his wounded arm above the surface. Behind them, the sound of explosions echoed through the mountain as Kellerman's killers tried to destroy any evidence of their presence. But the evidence was already flowing downstream, carried by an underground river toward federal jurisdiction, and the kind of justice that corporate money couldn't buy. They surfaced almost a mile from the cavern entrance, emerging into a hidden pool surrounded by cottonwood trees that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. The night air felt warm after the underground river's chill, and the stars overhead seemed brighter than Eli had seen them in years. "Where are we?" Morrison asked, shivering despite the mild temperature. "Safe," Eli replied, helping the deputy climb out of the pool. "And about 5 miles from the nearest federal facility, where we can hand over enough evidence to put Kellerman and his entire operation away for life." But as they prepared to begin the final phase of their journey toward justice, Eli found himself thinking not about victory, but about the brother who had made it possible. Caleb had died 30 years ago, but his careful preparation, his methodical gathering of evidence, and his unshakable faith in eventual justice had reached across 3 decades to provide the weapons needed for this final battle. Some bonds, Eli realized, were indeed stronger than death. The Federal Ranger Station sat like a beacon of hope in the pre-dawn darkness, its radio tower blinking red against the star-filled sky. But between Eli's small group and that sanctuary lay 5 miles of open terrain where Kellerman's hunters could use their superior equipment and numbers to devastating effect. "They'll have night vision, thermal imaging, probably even drones," Morrison said, as they studied the route from the concealment of a rocky outcrop. "And they know we're heading for federal jurisdiction. They'll try to intercept us before we can reach help." Eli nodded grimly, but his attention was focused on something else, the sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Kellerman wasn't just sending a few more killers to clean up loose ends. He was mounting a full-scale military operation to ensure that no evidence of the conspiracy ever reached federal hands. "There," Morrison pointed toward the southern approach. "Ground vehicles, at least 3 of them. They're setting up a perimeter to box us in." But Eli was studying a different kind of evidence, one that might prove even more devastating to Consolidated Western's criminal empire than the recordings and documents they'd already gathered. Hidden among Caleb's papers was a legal document that Eli had initially overlooked. In his focus on the murder evidence, a land deed that dated back to the original homestead claims of the 1880s. The deed wasn't for the Lazy Bee Ranch, which had been in the Brandt family for generations. It was for the mineral rights to a much larger tract that included virtually every piece of land that Consolidated Western had been mining for the past 40 years. And according to the legal description, those rights belonged not to the mining company, but to the heirs of Miguel Sandoval, the young boy who had died with Maria and Caleb 30 years ago. "Morrison," Eli said quietly, showing the deputy the ancient document. "Do you understand what this means?" Morrison studied the deed by flashlight, his eyes widening as he grasped the implications. Jesus Christ. They didn't just steal the land, they stole it from a child. Everything they've built, every dollar they've made, it's all based on property that legally belonged to Maria's son. And since Miguel died without heirs, those rights would revert to the state, wouldn't they? More than that. If we can prove the mining company knew about the legitimate ownership when they began operations, this becomes a case of knowing fraud on a massive scale. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen resources. The helicopters were closer now, their searchlights sweeping the terrain in coordinated patterns designed to flush out any hiding prey. But the approaching aircraft also brought something that Kellerman hadn't counted on: federal oversight of what was supposed to be a simple elimination mission. "Those aren't all corporate helicopters," Morrison observed, pointing toward the eastern horizon where additional aircraft were approaching. "That's a federal law enforcement formation. Someone's been monitoring our radio transmissions," Eli felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. The evidence they carried would indeed reach federal hands, but only if they could survive the next few minutes. Kellerman's killers were closing in for what they thought would be a final assault on helpless targets. But they were about to learn that some battles can't be won with superior firepower alone. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Ground vehicles racing across the desert floor, while helicopters provided air support and sniper teams tried to establish killing positions on the surrounding ridges. It was overwhelming force applied with military precision, the kind of operation that should have ended the threat to consolidated Western's empire once and for all. But Eli had spent 70 years learning to read the land, to understand how terrain could be used to defeat superior numbers, to turn natural features into weapons that could level any playing field. He led Morrison and Boone through a maze of arroyos and rock formations that channeled their pursuers into carefully chosen killing zones. The first helicopter went down when Eli's rifle fire disabled its tail rotor, sending the aircraft spinning into the desert floor in a spectacular fireball that lit up the night sky. The ground vehicles fared no better when they tried to follow the fugitives through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat, let alone heavily armored trucks. But it was Boone who provided the margin of victory that turned a desperate escape into a rout of Kellerman's forces. The old dog seemed to understand that this was his final mission, his last chance to protect the human he'd served faithfully for 12 years. When the sniper teams tried to establish firing positions, Boone was there to drive them back with the fury of a natural predator defending his pack. The dog's sacrifice came when a team of killers managed to corner Eli and Morrison in a narrow canyon with no apparent escape route. Boone charged directly into the muzzle flashes of automatic weapons, his attack disrupting their formation long enough for federal agents to arrive with overwhelming force. Eli knelt beside his faithful companion as the old dog's breathing grew shallow and labored. "You did good, boy," he whispered, stroking the graying fur that had been his constant companion through years of loneliness and loss. "You did real good." Federal agents swarmed over the battlefield with the efficiency that came from months of preparation. The radio intercepts, financial records, and witness testimony that Morrison had gathered formed the foundation of a case that would eventually destroy not just Consolidated Western, but the entire network of corruption that had enabled their crimes. Thomas Kellerman was arrested at his corporate headquarters in Salt Lake City, along with 17 other executives and government officials who had participated in the conspiracy. The mining company's assets were frozen, its operations shut down, and its illegal profits turned over to a federal fund for victims of corporate crime. But for Eli, the real victory came when federal investigators located the hidden grave where Caleb, Maria, and Miguel had been buried 30 years ago. The bodies were recovered, identified through dental records and DNA testing, and finally given the proper burial that had been denied them for 3 decades. At the funeral service, held in the small cemetery overlooking the Lazy Bee Ranch, Eli stood with Morrison and a handful of federal agents who had become allies in the fight for justice. The graves were marked with simple headstones that told the truth about their lives and deaths, not the lies that Kellerman's conspiracy had spread, but the reality of love, courage, and sacrifice that had ultimately triumphed over corporate greed. "Your brother was a hero," Morrison said quietly as they prepared to leave the cemetery. "He saved countless lives by gathering that evidence, even though he knew it would cost him his own." Eli nodded. But his attention was focused on something else, a letter that had arrived that morning from a federal prosecutor in Denver. The land deed that had been hidden among Caleb's papers was indeed valid, which meant that billions of dollars in stolen mineral rights would now revert to public ownership. The money would fund schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects throughout the region, ensuring that the victims of Consolidated Western's greed would finally receive some measure of compensation. It wasn't the life that Caleb had planned when he left the ranch 30 years ago in search of adventure and independence. But it was a legacy that would have made their father proud, a legacy built not on land or cattle or mineral wealth, but on the simple truth that some things matter more than profit, and some battles are worth fighting regardless of the cost. Standing beside his brother's grave, with the wind whispering through the canyon walls that had sheltered them both in life and death, Eli finally understood what Caleb had been trying to tell him all those years ago. Family wasn't just about blood or land or shared history. It was about choosing to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. About protecting the people you love, even when it cost you everything. About leaving something better for the next generation, even if you didn't live to see it flourish. Caleb had learned that lesson in the end. And now, finally, so had Eli. 6 months later, Eli sat in his grandfather's rocking chair on the front porch of the Lazy Bee Ranch, watching the sun rise over the canyon rim just as he had on countless mornings before. But everything was different now, transformed by the truth that had finally been allowed to see the light of day. The coffee in his hands was still black, still strong enough to wake the dead, but it no longer tasted bitter with regret and unfinished business. The silence of the early morning no longer felt empty, but peaceful, in the way that comes only after a long struggle has finally reached its end. Where Boone had once lain at his feet, a new companion now kept him company, a young blue heeler pup that one of his neighbors had brought him as a gift after hearing about the old dog's heroic sacrifice. The pup was energetic and eager to please, but sometimes Eli caught him sitting perfectly still and staring toward the distant mountains, as if listening for echoes of wisdom from his predecessor. "Easy there, Scout," Eli murmured, reaching down to scratch behind the pup's ears. "You've got big paws to fill, but we'll figure it out together." The ranch itself looked much the same as it always had, red rock and scrub brush stretching to the horizon, cattle moving slowly toward water in the early morning light. The kind of timeless landscape that had shaped 4 generations of Brant men. But the isolation that had once felt like a burden now felt like a blessing, a sanctuary where a man could reflect on the choices that defined a life. The federal investigation had concluded 3 months ago with the conviction of Thomas, Kellerman and his co-conspirators, on charges ranging from murder to fraud to conspiracy. The sentences had been harsh: life without parole for Kellerman, decades in federal prison for his accomplices, but no amount of justice could bring back the lives that had been lost. What mattered more was what had been built from the ashes of tragedy. The mining company's seized assets had funded a scholarship program for Native American students, a victim compensation fund for families affected by corporate crimes, and a new federal task force dedicated to investigating corruption in resource extraction industries. But the change that meant the most to Eli was visible just beyond the ranch house, where a new section of the family cemetery held 3 graves that had been empty for too long. The headstones were simple but elegant, carved from the same red sandstone that formed the canyon walls where Caleb, Maria, and Miguel had fought their final battle. The inscriptions told their story with the kind of honest directness that Eli had learned to value above all else. Caleb James Brant, 1967-1995 beloved brother. Husband and father, he died protecting the truth. Maria. Elena Sandoval, Brant, 1907-1995 devoted mother and wife. Her courage changed the world. Miguel. Antonio Sandoval, 1984-1995 innocent child. Eternal light. His legacy lives in the future. The largest headstone, positioned between Caleb's and Maria's graves, contained the text that Eli had spent weeks perfecting, a summary of their story that would ensure future generations understood what had really happened in these canyons 30 years ago. Here lie 3 souls who died defending justice against those who would trade human life for profit. They were silenced by corporate greed and official corruption, but their sacrifice ultimately exposed a conspiracy that stretched from local sheriff's offices to multinational boardrooms. May their courage inspire others to speak truth to power, no matter the cost. Every morning Eli walked from the ranch house to the cemetery, carrying fresh wildflowers that he picked from the meadow where Sarah was buried. He would spend a few minutes at each grave, sometimes talking to the dead as if they could hear him, sometimes just standing in contemplative silence. This morning, he had a visitor. Jake Morrison's pickup truck pulled into the ranch yard just as Eli was returning from his daily pilgrimage to the cemetery. The former deputy had left law enforcement after the trial, choosing instead to work as a private investigator, specializing in cases involving corporate malfeasance. His injured arm had healed well, leaving only a network of scars that served as a permanent reminder of the night when he'd chosen justice over loyalty to a corrupt system. "Morning, Eli," Morrison called as he climbed out of the truck. "Hope you don't mind the early visit, but I wanted to share some news." They settled into the porch chairs that Eli kept ready for the occasional visitor, and Morrison pulled out a thick manila folder that looked remarkably similar to the evidence packets that had brought down Consolidated. "Weston, remember how we could never figure out why your brother was so far from his planned route when he died?" Morrison asked. Why he was in that particular canyon instead of heading toward Colorado like he'd told Maria's cousin. Eli nodded, the question having nagged at him for months. According to Caleb's letters and journal entries, the family should have been traveling north toward safety, not deeper into the desert where they'd ultimately been trapped. "I've been working with a federal task force that's investigating other cases involving corrupt mining operations," Morrison continued, "and we found something interesting in Thomas Kellerman's personal papers that his lawyers tried to keep sealed." He opened the folder and pulled out a map that had been annotated in Kellerman's distinctive handwriting. Red X marks indicated locations throughout the canyon system, with dates and notes that painted a chilling picture of systematic hunting. "Kellerman didn't just order their deaths," Morrison explained. "He personally directed the manhunt, using helicopters and tracking teams to drive them away from the main roads and toward the remote canyons where his people could eliminate them without witnesses." Eli studied the map with growing understanding. He herded them like animals, made sure they had nowhere to run except deeper into the wilderness. "Exactly. And there's more." Morrison pulled out another document, a handwritten note in Kellerman's script that made Eli's blood run cold. This was found in his personal safe, along with trophies from other murders the company committed over the years. The note was brief but devastating. "The Brant boy shows more backbone than expected. Make sure his death sends a clear message to anyone else who might think about interfering with our operations." Creativity encouraged. It was the final piece of the puzzle. The confirmation that Caleb's murder hadn't been just about eliminating witnesses, but about terrorizing potential future opponents. Kellerman had wanted to create a legend of fear that would keep other honest people from asking inconvenient questions. Instead, he had created the evidence that would destroy him. "The federal task force is expanding their investigation," Morrison continued. "They've found similar patterns of corruption and violence in mining operations across 6 states. Your brother's documentation is being used as a template for exposing corporate conspiracies that go back decades." Eli folded the papers carefully and handed them back to Morrison. The information was important, but it couldn't change what had already been lost. What mattered now was ensuring that the sacrifices meant something, that the future would be different because of the courage shown by 3 people who had refused to be silenced. "There's something else," Morrison said quietly. "Something I think Caleb would have wanted you to know." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small photograph that Eli recognized immediately. It was the picture of Maria, Caleb, and Miguel that had started this whole journey 6 months ago. But now Morrison turned it over to reveal writing on the back that Eli had never noticed before. In Maria's delicate script were the words, "For Eli, the brother Caleb loved most in all the world. We hope someday you will forgive us for taking him away from you, and forgive him for choosing love over land. Your family always, Maria and Miguel." Eli's eyes filled with tears as he realized that Maria had been planning to reach out to him, to bridge the gap between the brothers that harsh words had created. She had understood that family was large enough to include everyone who was willing to love without conditions. And she had wanted to include Eli in the new life they were building together. "She knew," he said softly. "She knew Caleb still loved me, despite everything I'd said, and she knew he regretted the way things ended between you," Morrison replied. "The federal investigators found other letters she'd written but never sent, letters to you, explaining who she was and asking if you might want to meet your new sister-in-law and nephew. The future that might have been stretched out like a phantom limb, beautiful and impossible and forever lost. But in its place was something else, the knowledge that love had indeed triumphed over hatred, that courage had proven stronger than fear, and that truth had ultimately prevailed over the forces that would bury it in unmarked graves." As Morrison drove away and the morning settled into its familiar rhythm, Eli found himself thinking not about what had been lost, but about what had been found. He had recovered his brother's body, exposed his killers, and ensured that their story would be remembered. More importantly, he had learned that the bond between brothers was indeed stronger than death, stronger than words spoken in anger, stronger than 30 years of guilt and regret. The sun climbed higher over the canyon rim, painting the red rocks with the kind of light that made everything look newly created. Scout the puppy chased shadows across the porch, full of the kind of boundless energy that promised years of companionship ahead. And in the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, 3 headstones stood watch over the land that had sheltered them all. The living and the dead, the guilty and the innocent, the brothers